You are quiet because the machinery that once kept you legible to others has slowed, not healed, not resolved, but slowed enough to reveal itself. What binds you is not temperament or fate, but an inherited role that learned to survive by softening truth. Father and mother complexes stand behind this role like unseen architects, arranging love as a conditional contract. Approval was the currency. Shame the interest. People-pleasing the payment plan. You learned to explain yourself before anyone asked, to preempt rejection by offering obedience, to make yourself useful so existence would be permitted. This is not character. It is possession by a complex. Picture a kitchen at dusk. Plates are stacked but not put away. The phone lights the table with a name you recognize by the weight it brings to your chest. You answer already prepared to justify your tone, your delay, your boundary. Words come out rounded and gentle, filed down so they will not cut the listener. You apologize for needing air. You explain why your silence is not abandonment. You bargain for love with clarity you cannot afford. In that room the self is not seated. The role is, and the role speaks fluently. This quiet that has arrived is not peace. It is the moment before the furnace door closes. When the psyche withdraws its noise, it does so because the old arrangement has exhausted its returns. What you call fatigue is the body's refusal to continue a contract signed before language. Resentment follows. Then a thinning of identity. Authority drains away not because you lack strength but because strength has been outsourced to the maintenance of belonging. The repetition compulsion tightens. You meet the same faces with different names. You feel loyal and disgusted at once. Love is paired with fear, kindness with compulsion, closeness with the ache for escape. There is a cruelty in this truth that must not be softened. The role kept you alive, and it is now killing your capacity to stand. In the dark phase, the psyche blackens the image it once worshipped. What you believed was love reveals its price. The price is the erosion of an inner center. The body knows this first. Sleep fragments. Appetite duels. A cold humor appears when promises are made. The voice lowers. The room seems smaller. The same explanations feel obscene on the tongue. Night presses against the stone outside. Firelight breathes somewhere beyond the wall. A river sounds like a thought that will not be argued with. You believed that being understandable would keep you safe. But the psyche was actually converting your clarity into permission for invasion. The consequence was subtle. Each explanation trained the other to expect one. The mechanism was possession by the permission to exist contract. An unconscious agreement that said you may remain if you are legible, useful, agreeable. Projection did the rest. Others placed their disowned demands into your patience. You carried them as virtue. The myth of narcissists is misread when it is reduced to vanity. The image that matters is the surface that answers back. The one who is inflamed by persona does not love himself. He feeds on reflection. When your light was steady, it provided a surface. When you grew quiet, the surface rippled. The rage or confusion that follows is not about you. It is about the collapse of a mirror. This is a structure, not a diagnosis. Persona inflation requires an audience. When the audience withdraws, the performance grows louder, then incoherent. The darkness deepens because it must. Ash appears where ornament once stood. This is the stage where the psyche removes the borrowed crown. You begin to feel like a traitor to your own myth. Loyalty turns against itself. You recall holidays where you mediated storms you did not cause. Table conversations where you smiled to keep the temperature stable. Phone calls where you spoke as a buffer between two wheels that would not meet. The cost accumulates. Fatigue is no longer a symptom. It is a verdict. Frost gathers along the edges of the window. The owl's call is brief, precise. Nothing consoles it. You believed that kindness defined you, but the psyche was actually binding you to repetition. The consequence was authority loss. Your presence calmed rooms but never directed them. The mechanism was shadow identification with goodness. By refusing your own aggression, you loaned it to others. They returned it as entitlement. The more you soothed, the more you were required to soothe. This is how the moral self is used against the self. In this blackened field, Orpheus descends not because he is brave, but because his song cannot survive on the surface anymore. The underworld is not punishment. It is the only place where the music can be retuned. He looks back and loses what he loved because the old way of seeing cannot accompany him. This is not a warning against curiosity. It is the law of thresholds. What is retrieved cannot be carried with the same eyes. Silence thickens. Pine resin scents the air. The fire settles into a steady, unpersuasive glow. When the psyche washes, it separates. Awareness appears not as relief but as cold clarity. You see the unconscious contract for what it is. Belonging was role-based. Love arrived when you complied. Withdrawal followed when you stood. The permission to exist was conditional. This recognition does not comfort. It estranges. But estrangement is the solvent that dissolves possession. You believed that boundaries were an action you performed. But the psyche was actually revealing them as conditions of being. The consequence of misunderstanding this was endless negotiation. The mechanism was persona maintenance. You acted your limits instead of inhabiting them. Others learned to bargain because you presented the self as movable furniture. When the self becomes structural, bargaining ends without argument. Alchemy speaks of a whitening that follows the blackening. Do not mistake it for purity. It is the simple light of differentiation. You begin to see where your desire ends and another's begins. Projection loosens. You no longer carry the other's hunger as a mission. Possession releases its grip in increments, not with ceremony. The body straightens. The voice grows spare. Explanations die of neglect. Salt lies on the table, rough and granular. It preserves by drawing out excess. What remains keeps. The Egyptian image of the weighing of the heart offers no moral sermon. The heart is not judged by intention but by density. Feathers measure weightlessness. A heart burdened by roll sinks. A heart that has released borrowed weight floats. The image is precise. Emotional power is not volume. It is gravity without mass. You believed that silence meant withdrawal. But the psyche was actually consolidating force. The consequence is visible. Rooms no longer orbit you. They orient themselves. The mechanism is the seating of the self. When the center returns, the periphery adjusts. Some leave. Others grow respectful. None are convinced by explanation because explanation is no longer offered. Dreams shift. A house appears with rooms you never entered. A furnace hums in a basement you feared. You descend without narrative. Heat is not hostile when it is contained. Iron accepts shape only at the right temperature. Too cold and it shatters. Too hot and it loses integrity. The psyche regulates this heat with ruthless intelligence. Smoke thins. Stars cut the dark with indifferent precision. There is a danger here that masquerades as virtue. Moral inflation can replace persona inflation. The psyche will tempt you to turn clarity into superiority. Resist this by structure, not resolve. Authority that needs comparison is already lost. The self does not announce itself. It occupies. The red phase is not triumph. It is integration. Aggression returns to its rightful owner. Desire sheds apology. Boundaries cease to be arguments. They become facts. You do not withdraw to punish. You stand because standing is the only posture that allows breath. Jacob wrestles not an enemy but an unnamed force that refuses explanation. He leaves with a limp, not a doctrine. Authority costs something visible. It is carried in the gate. Those who demand proof will never be satisfied. Those who sense gravity adjust. Ash cools. The metal holds. Constellations wheel without comment. You believe that quiet meant loss. But the psyche was actually rebalancing power. The consequence is a life that stops asking permission. The mechanism is the dissolution of the family script's access to the present. When the script cannot reach you, it cannot recruit you. It searches elsewhere. This is not hope. It is weight. The self sits. The room learns its limits. Silence remains not as absence but as order. What follows the first consolidation is not relief but exposure. When the noise recedes, what remains is not emptiness but a sharper outline of what was always there. The psyche does not reward differentiation with comfort. It rewards it with accuracy. You begin to see how often love was confused with endurance, how loyalty became indistinguishable from self-erasure, how morality was recruited to protect a structure that could not survive daylight. This stage carries a peculiar loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of no longer being mirrored. The old system reflected you constantly through approval, through need, through conflict. When that system loses access, the mirrors go dark. What stands before you is unreflected existence. Many mistake this for loss of self. It is the opposite. It is the first time the self is not doubled by expectation. Iron cools slowly. If struck too soon it cracks. The psyche knows this and withholds encounters. Invitations diminish. Conversations shorten. The phone is quiet. Not because you are unwanted but because you are no longer predictable. Predictability was the currency that kept exchanges flowing. When it disappears, only real contact remains, and real contact is rare. You believed that withdrawal would provoke pursuit, but the psyche was actually testing whether you could remain without being summoned. The consequence is sobering. Those whose attachment depended on excess fall away without drama. The mechanism is repetition compulsion losing traction. When the familiar pattern cannot complete itself, it collapses into silence. This silence feels accusatory because the old self depended on being needed to feel real. There is a temptation here to fill the gap with explanation, to narrate your absence so others will not misinterpret it. Each time you resist this, something reorders inside. Authority is not asserted. It accrues. It accrues when behavior no longer seeks interpretation. Meaning settles like dust after a storm. A dream appears of a bridge without railings. Crossing it requires a pace that is neither hurried nor hesitant. Looking down induces vertigo. Looking ahead offers no promise. The bridge exists because it must, not because it reassures. This is how psychic transitions function. They do not convince. They require. The biblical image of Job is useful precisely because it refuses consolation. Everything that justified his world is stripped not to teach virtue but to expose the limits of explanation. His friends moralize. They demand narrative coherence. Job answers with refusal. He does not improve his language. He endures the absence of answers. Authority returns to him not through clarity but through alignment with what is. Night air presses against skin. Frost forms delicate geometries that vanish at touch. You believed that being good would protect you from power struggles. But the psyche was actually pushing you into them blind. The consequence was chronic surprise and aggression. The mechanism was shadow disownment. Power you refused to recognize did not disappear. It organized itself around you. When you reclaim it, not as dominance but as presence, struggles lose their theater. There is nothing to win against someone who is not auditioning. As integration deepens, resentment begins to dissolve. Not because forgiveness is chosen, but because the structure that generated resentment no longer exists. Resentment requires proximity without agency. When agency returns, resentment starves. This is not moral progress. It is architectural change. In this phase, memories reorder themselves. Scenes once charged with guilt lose their electricity. You see them with a cooler eye. The holidays negotiated like ceasefires. The praise given as bait. The criticism framed as concern. You are no longer inside these scenes. You observe their mechanics. Observation without commentary is a sign that possession has loosened. Ash settles in a hearth long unused. Its grayness is uniform, undramatic. You believed that asserting yourself would make you cruel. But the psyche was actually revealing cruelty as the distortion of withheld force. The consequence of misunderstanding this was passive harm to self and others. The mechanism was inversion. Aggression turned inward masquerades as virtue. When aggression returns to its rightful channel, it becomes discrimination, not violence. The Egyptian myth of Osiris offers an image without sentiment. He is dismembered, scattered, then reassembled. Nothing about this process is gentle. Isis does not persuade the parts. She finds them. Integration is retrieval, not invention. You do not become someone new. You gather what was exiled to keep love intact. Silence deepens again, but its quality changes. It is no longer hollow. It is dense. Conversations that do occur are slower, more exact. There is less laughter, but it rings truer. Humor shifts from appeasement to recognition. You laugh not to soften, but because something is precisely seen. You believed that emotional power was intensity, but the psyche was actually training you in containment. The consequence is paradoxical. Fewer words carry more weight. The mechanism is the alignment of effect with self rather than persona. When emotion is no longer used to manage others, it becomes information. Dreams bring thresholds, doors without handles, gates that open only when you stop pushing. These images teach without instruction. Effort that once worked now obstructs. Non-effort is not passivity. It is precision. The psyche withdraws access to old strategies to prevent regression. Firelight flickers across stone. The owl is silent tonight. As the red phase approaches, integration tests itself in contact. Someone speaks to you with the old expectation. The pause that follows is different now. It is not a search for words. It is the absence of urgency. You answer or you do not. Both are clean. There is no residue. This is how you know the contract is dissolving. Contracts leave residue when broken. Structures simply stand. You believed that explaining would preserve connection, but the psyche was actually preserving your subordination. The consequence was chronic negotiation. The mechanism was hierarchy formed by unconscious agreement. When you withdraw agreement without announcement, the hierarchy collapses without noise. Power does not need witnesses to function. There is grief here that must be named without ceremony. Not grief for others but for the time spent performing safety. This grief does not weep loudly. It sits. It looks. It passes when acknowledged as cost, not mistake. The psyche does not apologize for survival strategies. It retires them. Constellations turn with mechanical patience. They do not rush dawn. At this depth, morality becomes simpler, not kinder, not harsher, simpler. Acts align with structure. What fits remains. What does not is left without commentary. This is not detachment. It is fidelity to form. The self recognizes what belongs by resonance, not by rule. You believed that peace would announce itself, but the psyche was actually installing gravity. The consequence is a life that no longer needs to be interpreted to be valid. The mechanism is the final seating of authority. When authority is seated, silence is no longer a void. It is the medium through which order is felt. The quiet does not lift. It settles. And in settling, it rebalances everything around it. What now tests you is not pressure but invitation. When authority begins to seat itself, the world probes its edges, not aggressively, not consciously. It tests by omission. Messages that once arrived with urgency now arrive without tone. Requests are phrased vaguely. Expectations appear unspoken but assumed. This is how old structures search for their former access by ambiguity. Ambiguity once activated your reflex to clarify. Now it meets something firmer. You notice a new sensation, neutrality where anxiety used to live. Not indifference but a steady absence of compulsion. This absence is misread by others as distance, sometimes as coldness. In truth, it is the psyche conserving force. Emotional power does not rush outward. It radiates by remaining. You believed that clarity would provoke conflict, but the psyche was actually revealing how conflict relied on your participation. The consequence is uncanny calm in situations that once escalated. The mechanism is withdrawal of effective fuel. When projection finds no surface, it falls back to its source. Silence becomes a mirror too honest to tolerate. A dream arrives of a marketplace at dawn. Stalls are half-built. Voices echo without bodies. You walk through without stopping. Nothing calls your name. This is not abandonment. It is release from being summoned by appetite that is not yours. Gnostic images speak here without theology. The archons are not monsters. They are systems that demand energy to continue. They rule by habit, not by strength. When attention is withdrawn, they do not fight. They starve. What you once experienced as domination was dependence inverted. You were feeding what claimed to rule you. The body registers this before the mind accepts it. Shoulders settle. The jaw unclenches. Breath finds a lower register. These are not techniques learned. They are permissions returned to the organism. The nervous system recognizes when it no longer must perform belonging. Night deepens. The scent of damp earth rises. Somewhere, iron cools in open air. You believed that loyalty required presence at all costs. But the psyche was actually redefining loyalty as alignment. The consequence is fewer appearances, fewer explanations, fewer reconciliations that require self-distortion. The mechanism is differentiation solidifying into habit. Habit, once changed, no longer argues. Memory brings forward an image of Persephone. Her descent is seasonal, lawful, impersonal. She does not negotiate spring. She inhabits both worlds without pleading for either. The underworld does not corrupt her. It completes the cycle. What returns is not innocence but sovereignty over time. This is where disgust often appears, and it must be understood correctly. Disgust is not contempt for others. It is the psyche rejecting conditions that violate form. You feel it when old conversations resume their grooves, when familiar emotional trades are offered. Disgust protects boundaries when politeness would dissolve them. It is a guardian emotion, crude but accurate. You believed that feeling repelled meant becoming unloving. But the psyche was actually restoring discrimination. The consequence is cleaner contact. The mechanism is the return of instinct from exile. Instinct does not justify itself. Its signals are final. Dreams now simplify. Fewer images, stronger contrasts. A door either opens or does not. A path either holds weight or collapses. There is little symbolism to interpret because the psyche is no longer speaking around resistance. It speaks plainly when it is not negotiating. Salt crunches underfoot. Frost whitens the grass. Each step sounds decisive. As the red phase stabilizes, you notice a shift in how others speak around you. Some lower their voices. Some perform less. Some test with subtle provocations as if checking whether the old reflex will reappear. When it does not, they recalibrate or retreat. This is not victory. It is sorting. You believed that being needed was proof of value. But the psyche was actually teaching you how value operates without demand. The consequence is a life that attracts fewer crises. The mechanism is the cessation of unconscious recruitment. When you no longer play the role of regulator, dysregulated systems look elsewhere. The biblical image of the burning bush functions psychologically here. The bush burns without being consumed. Attention is drawn not by destruction but by containment. Authority that does not consume itself becomes a focal point. Others notice without knowing why. Firelight steadies. The night holds its shape. There is a risk at this stage of mistaking quiet for withdrawal from life. That error leads to rigidity. The self does not retreat. It reorganizes engagement. You still meet others but not at the cost of inner coherence. Engagement becomes selective without becoming defensive. Defense belongs to threatened structures. What is seated does not defend. It endures. You believed that intensity equaled sincerity. But the psyche was actually training you in proportion. The consequence is emotional economy. The mechanism is alignment between stimulus and response. When response fits stimulus, drama evaporates. What remains is accuracy. In relationships that persist, a new dynamic appears. Conflicts surface quickly or not at all. There is little slow poison. Either form holds or it fractures. This speed is often mistaken for harshness. It is structural honesty. Slow decay required your accommodation. Without it, structures reveal their integrity immediately. A dream house appears again, but this time you are not searching rooms. You sit in one. The walls are plain. There is a window. Nothing more. Outside, weather changes without consequence. Inside, stillness remains. This is not isolation. It is habitation. Iron glows briefly in the forge, then darkens into shape. You believed that love demanded endurance of discomfort, but the psyche was actually separating love from compulsion. The consequence is that affection survives where obligation dies. The mechanism is the disentangling of attachment from fear. When fear exits, love no longer needs proof. Some relationships end here without argument. Others transform quietly. There is no announcement. Announcements belong to persona. Structure changes without comment. Those who require explanation feel injured. Injury is not always harm. Sometimes it is the loss of leverage. Constellations reappear between clouds. They do not rearrange for anyone. At this depth, the family script attempts one final access. It arrives disguised as nostalgia, duty, concern. The pull is subtle because it knows force will fail. You feel the old ache, the old reflex to step in, to smooth, to absorb, and then something holds. Not effort. Wait. The self is seated. The script finds no handle. You believed that resistance would require struggle, but the psyche was actually ending the struggle by removing the battlefield. The consequence is anticlimactic calm. The mechanism is closure without ceremony. Contracts dissolve when no one signs them again. There is sadness here, clean and brief. It passes like weather. What remains is orientation. You know where you stand because standing is no longer performed. Ash cools completely. The hearth does not ask for fuel. What you carry now is not confidence. It is inevitability. Inevitability does not persuade. It does not defend. It does not chase. It simply occupies space in a way that alters the field around it. The quiet deepens once more, not as retreat but as settlement. Emotional power has rebalanced because nothing inside you is negotiating for permission. What remains now is not work but verification. The psyche tests what has seated itself not through crisis but through ordinariness. Days pass without signal. No dramatic confrontations arrive to confirm your transformation. This absence unsettles the part of you that learned to measure reality by intensity. Yet intensity was never truth. It was friction created by misalignment. When alignment holds, life becomes deceptively plain. Plainness is the final trial. You wake, eat, move through rooms, speak when necessary, remain silent when speech would be decorative. Nothing demands explanation. Nothing asks for proof. This is where many regress, not out of weakness but out of nostalgia for emotional weather. Storms once proved you mattered. Calm feels anonymous. The psyche watches carefully to see whether you will manufacture disturbance to feel real again. You believed that meaning required struggle, but the psyche was actually releasing you from struggle as a condition for meaning. The consequence is a strange humility. The mechanism is the ego relinquishing its role as generator of significance. When the self holds center, meaning radiates without effort. There is a dream of a field after harvest. Stubble remains. The land is not barren. It is resting. No one applauds this rest. No one records it. Yet it determines what can grow next. This is how psychic authority sustains itself, by knowing when not to produce. The final integration does not add qualities. It subtracts distortions. You do not become braver. Fear simply loses its leverage. You do not become wiser. Confusion stops recruiting you. You do not become more loving. Love is no longer traded for safety. You notice how rarely you say, "I understand." Understanding was once a bridge you built to prevent distance. Distance is no longer a threat. You can allow others to remain opaque. Opacity does not offend the self. Only the persona demanded transparency to feel secure. Night returns without symbolism. Just night. In this settled phase, something precise occurs in speech. Words slow, not from caution but from irrelevance. Many things no longer require naming. When you do speak, the words land without padding. There is no preface, no softening clause, no apology for existing as you are. Others may fill the space with reaction. You do not. You believed that restraint meant suppression. But the psyche was actually restoring proportion. The consequence is a voice that carries because it is not compensating. The mechanism is effect no longer inflated to secure position. Inflation collapses under its own weight. Proportion endures. An image surfaces from astronomy. A planet that clears its orbit not by force but by mass. Smaller bodies either align or move away. There is no intent. There is physics. Emotional authority functions the same way. It does not confront. It organizes. There is no triumph in this. Triumph implies comparison. Comparison belongs to the old economy of worth. What replaces it is neutrality, firm, unspectacular neutrality. This neutrality unnerves those accustomed to negotiating with your emotion. They search for tells, for cracks, for urgency. They find none. You believed that being fully yourself would provoke endless conflict. But the psyche was actually revealing that conflict thrived on partial presence. The consequence is fewer battles because there is no flank to attack. The mechanism is wholeness eliminating angles. Dreams fade in frequency. When they appear, they are brief. An object placed where it belongs. A path taken without commentary. Dreams now confirm rather than instruct. Instruction was needed when resistance was active. Confirmation arrives when alignment holds. Pine needles crack softly underfoot. The air is thin and clean. At this depth, compassion changes texture. It is no longer adhesive. It does not bind you to outcomes. You can witness suffering without rushing to redeem it. This is often misinterpreted as coldness. In truth, it is respect for the other's psyche. Interference was once a way to avoid your own fear of separation. You believed that stepping back meant abandonment, but the psyche was actually ending intrusion. The consequence is dignity on both sides. The mechanism is recognition of psychic boundaries as real, not negotiated. The last image the psyche offers is simple. A threshold with no guard. Passing through requires nothing, no oath, no promise, no vow to be better. You step because you are already on the other side. This is where the family script loses its final access. Not because you confronted it, healed it, or forgave it, but because it no longer corresponds to anything alive in you. Scripts require actors. You are no longer available for casting. There is no ceremony when this happens. No announcement. No relief. Just a mild surprise. One day, when a familiar situation arises and nothing moves inside you, the hook finds no tissue. The reflex does not fire. You stand unchanged and the moment passes like a misfired signal. Stone holds the day's warmth. Night does not rush in. What has returned to you is not power as dominance, nor power as control. It is power as placement. You are where you are. You remain. Others must now locate themselves in relation to that fact. This quiet does not lift because it is not a phase. It is a condition. Emotional power rebalances when nothing inside you is seeking to be granted existence. The self is seated. The rest reorganizes accordingly.